Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. May is here, and we are continuing our focus on all things Ukraine. It is the story of our time. It is the story of our moment. And we're going to continue to bring you impactful, important leaders from inside and around the war. And I am very, very thankful, humbled, and inspired to have joining us now on Independent Americans the great and powerful Nolan Peterson joins us on Independent Americans. Welcome to the show, Nolan.
Thank you for having me.
So you've got a really interesting past, man. You've been an author, you've been U.S. Special Forces, and now you're in Ukraine. I want to start by asking you the question I ask everybody: where are you, and how are you, Nolan?
Well, I'm hanging in there, doing much better now that the Ukrainian army has kicked the Russians out of Kyiv's perimeter. So currently I am in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, where I've lived for 8 years. And yeah, I think, it's sort of a moment of contradiction, I think, here in Kyiv, because we are very grateful and, just exuberant in a way that the threat to our city of a sack, an actual ground invasion of this capital city of more than 3 million people has passed. However, we still have missile threats. We still have daily air raid alerts. So the threat of, random death from the air still exists. And also there are, very heavy battles still going on in the south and the east, most particularly in Mariupol. So, it's a moment to both rejoice for the fact that, there aren't Russian soldiers in the streets hunting down like me who speak out against what Russia is doing. But also a moment to take pause and I think, sort of acknowledge the fact that this incredibly savage and destructive war, we may only be at the end of the beginning at this point, and it may not end anytime soon.
I'm glad you're framing up with that perspective, because one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, Nolan, is because I think America is already, in some ways, sadly, unfortunately, starting to change the channel a little bit. They get exhausted by conflict. We saw that in Afghanistan. Now we've got Roe v. Wade. The midterm elections are coming up. But you grew up in Florida. You were in the Air Force. Can you take us back? How did you end up in Ukraine first? And when did you first end up in Ukraine? I know you've been around the world reporting and writing, but how did you end up connected to Ukraine, and when did that happen?
Yeah, so when I was in the Air Force as a pilot in Air Force Special Operations, I think I experienced something that many people in the military, particularly who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and other combat zones around the world, you feel there's this feeling when you came home that the civilian population in America were very sort of quarantined, to use a term of our time, from the realities of the things that were going on around the world, the dark forces that, we are sort of holding back from our country, sort of unknowingly to the majority of the American population. So, when I would come home from my deployments, and particularly when my younger brother, Drew, was in the Air Force, and he was deployed as well to Afghanistan several times, it was just this sense like you just almost want to grab people and be like, don't you understand what's going on in the world? Don't you get it? Like, don't you understand that it's important for us to push back against, these forces of evil in the world that still exist? And so I think when I had the opportunity to leave the Air Force, I was at the time unmarried, no mortgage. So when I had the chance, I jumped at it. But I thought that it was important, and it was another way of basically serving my country, to become a journalist and to come back and to tell those stories, to come back with the truth, because I think it's a responsibility for every citizen in a democracy, to understand what's going on in the world, because we are not immune from wars in foreign lands. And I think, the last several decades have certainly shown us that. So anyway, I decided to become a journalist. And like many aspiring war correspondents, I kind of just plowed through my savings, freelanced in Afghanistan, and I was looking for sort of a story that I really gravitated toward emotionally. And when, in 2014 was a very busy busy year as far as global conflicts are concerned. That was the year that ISIS was rampaging across the Middle East. You had the war in Israel. And also that was the year that the war in Eastern Ukraine began. I had a friend who I flew with actually in Afghanistan, working at the at the embassy here in Kyiv at the time, and he said, "Man, come over. There's a conventional war going on that is not getting the amount of attention it needs." So I came over here thinking I'd be here for a couple of weeks, and lo and behold, I witnessed a tank battle in Mariupol that summer, and I remember sitting there, literally on a hilltop, like a scene from that movie Fury, watching tanks shoot each other, just thinking,
Mm.
like, how is this not a front page story in every newspaper in the world? And it was getting attention, but it just felt like the um, the stakes were so incredibly high. And even then, I had this sense that this war was just like this pile of tinder waiting to be ignited that could become a much bigger conflict, one that the United States and our NATO allies would not be able to ignore once it escalated into a much bigger war one day. So anyway, I just made the decision to stay here in Ukraine. Over the years, I've been here for 8 years now. I often flirted with the idea of going back to the United States or whatever, but I always suspected, I should say, that this war was going to become a much bigger disaster. And unfortunately, that's what happened. I also have to say, I married a Ukrainian woman. Half my family is now Ukrainian. Many of my friends are Ukrainian. So there's also an emotional connection to this country that I think I felt. But within your audience, many American veterans or active duty personnel, you know, I've seen a lot of our best values reflected in the Ukrainian people.
Mm.
And I always felt like I owed it to them to be here and tell their story, because they're fighting for the things that we fought for. I was 19 years old on 9/11, and I remember how mad I was to see my country attacked and to feel like our way of life and the things we value were being targeted, and we're being not threatened per se. I don't think our country is ever existentially threatened by Al Qaeda, but those things were being attacked. And so I think here in Ukraine, you see that same passion to defend their way of life and a better future for their country. And it's a story that really you know emotionally resonated with me. And I over these past few months of full-scale warfare now I'm both very saddened to see what's happened to this country, but also in a way, I mean, if there's one good thing that's come out of this, I guess it's like this story about Ukraine is now being more widely told. And I think bravery of the Ukrainian people, not just the soldiers but the civilians as well, and their commitment to the things we value: democracy, equal rights, liberty, freedom, all these things that we cherish. We see that now. We see what they hold dear. And so I think that this has been a moment for Ukraine to be in the spotlight. And so I guess, like I said, if there's one positive outlook or a positive outcome of this conflict, it's been that.
Well, you're bravely shining that spotlight, and that's why I think your reporting and your Twitter feed has been indispensable. Adrian Bronnenberger and I spoke about your work in the last episode when I talked to he and his wife Irina, and they told their heroic story. But I think it's also interesting, Nolan, that you're doing it from an unconventional perspective. Your background is unconventional. Your voice is very powerful, especially your ability to communicate these two worlds and to interpret what this means for Ukraine, what it means for the world, and what it means for America. I've said before, I think right now the Ukrainians are embodying American values better than Americans are in many ways, right? And it's a mirror for us to think about what we really stand for and what we would really do. But I want to explore the way you're doing it. You're not over there for NBC News or for the AP. You're the senior editor for Coffee or Die magazine. Which is going to be new to some folks. So can you explain what is Coffee or Die magazine, and how is your perspective? How has that enabled you to have a different perspective than maybe conventional journalists or traditional mainstream journalists who may be over there or may not even be over there? They may be sitting behind a desk while you're out in the field reporting.
Right. So Coffee or Die magazine is the news site of Black Rifle Coffee Company. And it's I guess a couple years ago, you could call it a startup news site, but I think we're well on our way now. Our collective team has done some incredible work. We have both veterans who have become journalists as well as civilians. So we bring both perspectives. But yeah, I think we value stories that matter to our audience, particularly focusing on people who have served in the military, first responders or people who are in the military. And so there's a certain angle that we shoot for with our work. But I think as veterans or people who have military backgrounds, you do see war in a different way, but you also look for stories that might otherwise be overlooked by the so-called mainstream media. I know it's kind of a cliche term, but it is somewhat true. And I think the most obvious example of that is the fact that I've been here for a long time, right? And I think that this winter, when Russia started massing troops on the border, this became just every journalist on planet Earth came to Kyiv, or in particular, but Ukraine more generally, to cover this monumental story, and for good reason, because it is the story, probably the biggest story of our time. But the thing is, there's been a war going on here for 8 years, right? Two of the largest land armies in Europe have been shooting at each other since 2014. Where were all these journalists all that time? And there have been other very excellent journalists who've been here during these years, but by and large, the focus of the mainstream media has not been on Ukraine during all these years of warfare. They've dipped their toes in it, or they'll have a correspondent based in Moscow coming here from time to time, hiring a fixture and getting a story and then leaving. So I think that, I think the greatest advantage of working for sort of a non-traditional media outlet is that they saw value in having a full-time war correspondent in Ukraine, even when this was not the hottest, story in the world. And so I've been able to be here to see the evolution of this country, both its society and its military. And I think that, how that shapes my coverage is that I understand that incredible moment of resistance that we saw beginning on February 24th in Ukraine, it didn't happen in a vacuum. The last 8 years have been prologue to that. And everything that's happened these past 8 years kind of built up this incredible grit and resilience in Ukrainian society, where you had civilians on day one grabbing Kalashnikovs and heading out for the front lines, civilians, organizing clothing and supplies for the soldiers and for refugees, and just this incredible moment of national unity that I think caught a lot of, just civilians around the world, just media consumers, but also I'd even think it caught our government off guard too. They predicted Kyiv would fall within a matter of days, and it didn't happen. So long story short, I think there's a lot of value to being able to invest a journalist in a story for a long time, so that when something like this full-scale war happens, you have that context and that background to report on it in sort of a less superficial way.
And it seems like you have room to run, right? Like, Black Rifle Coffee is not going to be what people automatically, especially folks outside the community, assume will be funding investigative journalism, supporting conflict journalism. But this is a whole new media dynamic. And, the Pulitzers just happened this week. So there's nothing stopping, you from getting a Pulitzer writing for Coffee or Die any more than if you work at NPR or somewhere else. So the rules, I think, have been broken. And the way the communication landscape around Ukraine has evolved, I think, is also really a next generation of warfare, right? It's not just kinetic warfare, it's cyber, it's the threat of nukes, but also the entire communication framework is very different. And I think the Ukrainians have been underappreciated for their mastery of communication. And just an example, they control the information flow from the front lines pretty well, right? There aren't investigative reporters roaming around with scandals about the Ukrainian military or anything else that sometimes you see in a conflict of this scale and scope. Can you talk about, from how you've reported, Nolan, how are you reporting? Like, you're getting out there, you have these local contacts, you speak the language, you have a family. How you report different from somebody who might do a pop-up for national TV or beam in a 2-minute report? What has it been looking like for you for the last 3 months as you've been out there? And can you tell us, what do you think are the story that America needs to know most right now? Mariupol is under siege. The steel factory may collapse while we're recording this. What has your reporting revealed that you think most Americans still don't understand or appreciate?
So I think, specifically talking about my reporting, I think, one thing that, just not to tout myself too much here, but I think, because I've been here for so long, and like you said, I speak the language and I'm very well connected with both soldiers and civilians here. I don't need a fixer.
Hmm.
I am my own fixer in a way, and so I'm not reliant on a local producer or a local journalist to kind of guide me toward what stories are available. I'm able to enterprise my own stories based on my own connections. And if you want to talk about like getting access to frontline units or very unique groups, both volunteers, soldiers, whatever, a lot of that comes down to trust. And I'm not just some random person off the street. Like a lot of times, these are people I've known for years. I've previously been on the front lines with them. And so they, both give me access, but then also understand that I know the rules of the road as far as not reporting on something that would violate operational security. So they put them at risk, right? Like not photographing a power line or something that's going to show the Russians where these soldiers are. I interviewed a Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot, and we had a 2-hour discussion of which about 5% I could actually report on, because once we got going and we started talking about my background as a Air Force pilot and his, he really started to open up and tell me things that will make a great book one day, but unfortunately I can't report on now. So I think that having been here for so long, it allows me to find stories that the rest of the journalism herd maybe isn't going toward, because they all sort of rely on the same kind of group of ideas, for their stories.
Yeah.
So I can find, everybody goes left, I can kind of go right and find something unique. But also, I think that, once I'm out there in the field, my level of access is pretty high just because I have the trust and the faith of the soldiers and the civilians who are in harm's way. So yeah, I think that, those are sort of my advantages for being here, but also, there's so many very emotional human stories too. And a lot of these, if you go out to a frontline unit, like most of these soldiers weren't soldiers 2 months ago, they were civilians. Right. And to know, where they were, a lot of them were veterans of the war in the Donbass, whom I know who struggled with post-traumatic stress for years. And now suddenly they're back in the thick of things. So I think there's a whole kind of many layers of context that somebody like me, and there are other journalists who have been here for a long time, but we're able to bring to the story because we haven't just showed up, sort of once things got hot. As far as,
can I pull on one thread there, because I think we've got you here as a United States Air Force pilot. You talked about the MiG-29 pilot that you interviewed. Can we focus in on that for a second and maybe pull out a bit, because I feel like the air component of this war has been kind of seen in awe and in myth, maybe even now. Another one of those things that most talking heads predicted that the Russians were going to get air superiority immediately and they were going to dominate because of that. We've kind of slid past some of these groupthink ideas that were in the early stage of the war, and that was one of them. Can you talk about that part of your reporting? What did you learn from talking about that pilot? And as a pilot yourself, what part of that story do you think folks need to understand back home in the States?
That platforms are not, God, right? That the human element, even in a domain of warfare, which is so connected to technology as air combat, the talent, the creativity, and the guts of the human beings who are in combat still really matters. And so I think the air war here is an incredible example of the fact that, in this age of high-tech warfare, the Russian pilots are clearly not as talented as their Ukrainian adversaries. The Ukrainian pilots, several of whom I've talked to, said that the Russians have struggled to fly in inclement weather.
Right.
That they got very used to flying in a very low threat environment in Syria. So when the war started here, they thought they were just going to have at it, tread on here, own the airspace on day one. But the Ukrainians' ground-based air defenses were much more resilient and much more effective, probably with some U.S. intelligence help along the way.
Yeah.
But also the pilots proved that, they were going to keep flying. And I think that really, without getting into any details that would compromise them, I think it comes down to a lot of creativity, the ability to relocate to different airfields, to operate with degraded equipment and technology, and all these things played into the Ukrainians' favor. Their ability to MacGyver solutions,
Yeah.
using low tech solutions to kind of overcome their weaknesses when it comes to the Russians, and their ability to take enormous risks. And I think that, all of that depends on incredible training. Like, if you're going to take huge risks, it doesn't count for anything if you don't have the skills to back it up. Right.
Right.
And all your creativity doesn't count for anything if you don't have the skills to back it up. So I think that, you know, the air war here certainly is a lesson that I hope that our military is taking notes on, is, in the sense that, you know, there is a certain point, I believe, in modern warfare where technology is going to kind of cancel itself out. And our pilots, if we lose GPS, if we lose all these Gucci tools we've gotten used to, can we still eyeball lobbing a bomb onto a target like in World War II? Can we still, fly VFR? Can we fly at night without using instruments? Like, or
Yeah. Yeah.
GPS,
Yeah.
like all
Yeah.
these things that maybe, we sort of lost those skill sets a little bit as we become dependent on technology. And I think the Ukrainians have shown that being able to work around those deficits pays dividends in a high-end war like this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Nolan. The creativity, the ingenuity. We used to say all the time in the American infantry, adapt, improvise, and overcome. But that's also trained into you. So you can see also the decentralized leadership that's been a part of the Ukrainian training, in contrast to the Russian leadership, which is so regimented and so hierarchical, right? We're seeing the creativity of Ukraine really be a tremendous difference maker on everything from weather to equipment breakdowns. And that seems to be the ethos of the military that I think most outsiders didn't appreciate the differences around, right? The ability to continue to iterate and improvise, and just the sheer guts of what we're seeing from the Ukrainians across the board, military and civilian, I think has been stunning and inspiring. But I want to ask you, Nolan, if you can also pull back on another piece that you may have a unique insight. We've talked about foreign fighters on this show. We've talked to Americans who've trained people. We've talked to folks who are going over or are there now. Can you talk about this piece? And let me ask you, what do you know about foreign fighters that are now in Ukraine? And is it an overhyped story? Are we making it a bigger story than it is because we're Americans and we're so self-absorbed that we want to hear about ourselves? Can you pull that apart for us from your unique perspective as an American veteran yourself, who's been there for 8 years? What's your take on that story, Nolan?
Yeah, so you brought up a really great point, which is, you know, so to back up from the foreign fighter part of it real quick, but as far as the intelligence we're providing the Ukrainians and the weapons, all those things are essential to their war effort. However, I think we need to be careful when, sometimes you hear, Pentagon officials saying, what we're seeing now in Ukraine is the product of our 8 years of training or whatever. That's not true. Like, I've witnessed the training in Western Ukraine at Yavoriv several times over the years. And I got to say, it was the Ukrainians, when it comes to combat skills, were teaching the Americans more than vice versa. Because how many American soldiers have any, combat experience against tanks and trench warfare, heavy artillery, air attacks? I don't, maybe there's some people who've served in Desert Storm who can remember that stuff.
Yeah.
But
the Americans with that experience are in their 80s and 90s right now. Yeah, with a couple of exceptions, maybe from Fallujah, but beyond that, very limited. And I think that's an important part of kind of revealing the American arrogance. We're in no position to be teaching most of these guys about any of this, right?
Exactly. And they've been on the weak side of the fight for a long time. And they've had, less capable equipment, older equipment, and they've had to keep harping on this, but to be incredibly creative and flexible to use what they've got and to improvise solutions over the past 8 years to not just survive against the Russians, but to hold their own for the last 8 years in that stalemated war in the Donbass. And now in the full-scale war, they've pushed the Russians back from Kyiv, Kharkiv now, and they've largely kept the Russian offensive in the south and the east at bay for the last month or so since the Battle of Kyiv was won. So, we, like, for example, we give Ukraine all these new weapons. Like, we served in the U.S. military. I don't know if you could hand a soldier or a pilot some new gear in the United States and have them be able to use it in combat 2 days later. We'd need, all sorts of new operating procedures and
There'd be a
lessons.
lot of safety briefings,
Yeah, like
a
it's
lot of
like,
safety briefings, right?
yeah, and I think that, yes, all the javelins and NLAWs and all that stuff was incredibly important, but I think we should also not overlook the fact that Ukrainians were actually able to use these things
Yeah,
incredibly quickly on the battlefield.
yeah,
And, that speaks a lot, I think, to their adaptability and their flexibility. So I think, again, the things that the United States and NATO have done, particularly the equipment and the intelligence support, has been essential. However, none of that would have meant a damn thing if the Ukrainians hadn't had the sort of the characteristics to be able to implement those tools in a way that was effective on the battlefield. As far as the foreign fighters, you know, the foreign fighters have not made a difference on the battlefield as far as allowing Ukraine to, change the tide of battle or win the Battle of Kiev. Um, you know, in the individual units where these foreign fighters serve, they've certainly been incredibly effective. I think their level of training, especially the guys who come from special operations backgrounds, has been super useful. But I think, more globally, I think that the sort of the message that sends to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian soldiers that foreigners, Americans, Brits, Canadians, people from around the world are willing to come and fight in their war, it means a lot, because there is certainly a sense in Ukraine today, as there has been for a long time, that they're sort of holding back the Russian threat from the rest of Europe. And to feel like there are other soldiers from other countries who are willing to come join in that fight, it means a lot to them, and it improves their morale for sure. But I wouldn't say that the presence of the foreign fighters has been a decisive factor in the war. But that said, within the units where they serve, they've certainly helped their comrades and taught them things from their training, which have been helpful. But I think overall, it's been more of a morale booster for the Ukrainians than a combat edge, so to
yeah.
speak.
That's really helpful perspective, Nolan. Can I ask you to drill down the story of the moment? Maybe Mariupol, right, and the Azov, and now trapped, wounded folks, the last stand, the Alamo of this phase at least of the war in Ukraine. What can you tell us from your sources, your reporting, or just your perspective? What's happening there that folks may not see elsewhere and need to know about?
Well, I think we all know that it's hell on earth there. I've had the chance to. I'm texting one of the Azov soldiers who was there, and just he describes an incredibly sort of apocalyptic environment. I think that Mariupol has become the Grozny of this war, a city that's just been annihilated. Russia could not take it in any other way other than just wiping it off the map. But I think to sort of try and glean the significance of the Mariupol battle, and I think that one thing we should understand is that the Azovstal factory represents about a fifth of Mariupol's land area. And the fact that the Russians now, more than 2 months in the war, still haven't taken it. And you got a diehard group of maybe 1,000, that's very much an estimate, Ukrainian soldiers still holding out there under relentless bombing and just, horrible conditions, cut off from supply lines, all these things. The fact that they're still able to hold out and tie up Russian forces in Mariupol, I think it speaks both to, just, I don't want to say the incompetence, but the inability of Russia to achieve its aims on the ground. And it's a case study in just the mind-boggling fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, that they're willing to fight to the death. And so I think that here in Kyiv, you see banners of the word Mariupol everywhere, and you see it's become this symbol of resistance.
Yeah.
And I think that as the war goes on, the longer the war goes on, the more Russia is incriminating itself in the eyes of the Ukrainian people, and the more these stories of heroism galvanize the Ukrainian nation to continue their resistance, right? And so I think that it I could say now, more than 2 months in the war, the level of war fatigue in Ukraine is very low. And I communicate very often with my friends on the front lines, and they're still enthusiastic. It's tough. They're going through hell. A lot of them have been wounded and returned to the front lines. but they absolutely 100% believe in victory.
Mm.
There's never, even from day one, there was never any doubt they're going to lose this thing. And that was incredible. That was by far for me the most striking thing is that first day when the cruise missiles started raining down on Kyiv and across the country, and you heard, you knew the Russians were invading from Belarus and heading toward Kyiv, and I was like, man, this is scary. Like, what are they gonna, like, if a Russian soldier comes and knocks on my door, what am I gonna do? And seriously thinking about this.
Yep.
But among my Ukrainian friends, they never took that, like, it was a scary moment, but most of them were still very confident in the fact that they were going to win this war. And so I think you see that sort of, not to be too much of a, too much of a cheerleader for Ukraine here, but I think it's a really remarkable moment we're seeing where this country really believed in victory from day one. And I think that, stories like, the holdouts, Ukrainian defenders in Mariupol, not giving up, not surrendering, I think that certainly represents the spirit and the mood in Ukraine. And it also kind of symbiotically reinforces that spirit of resistance across the country.
I think that is so important and so underestimated. Just the will to fight and the magnitude of the moral stance and the righteousness, and just the stories of heroism that continue to reverberate. Whether it's Snake Island or now Mariupol or the ghost of Kyiv. I mean, the legends are growing, but you don't even have to make up legends because the actual heroism is so widespread and so consistent and so obvious, right? I mean, this is,
right.
we all, in my view, should be cheerleaders for Ukraine right now because it's good versus evil. This is the clearest fight we've ever had, at least in my lifetime. And I think it's a time for folks to recognize that and not be apologetic about it. I want to ask you, if I can, number one, I hope you can stick around for a little bit extra for our
Absolutely.
Patreon members. We're going to ask you a couple of questions. I want to ask you about that guitar behind you and some other stuff that you do to keep yourself sane. That'll be for our Patreon members only. So if you're not one of them, please join us and you'll get that extra content with Nolan. But Nolan, you've been telling personal stories in a way that is obviously reflective of your connections there. And you told the story of a hero, Alexander Makhov. Can you tell folks who haven't read your piece who he was and why you thought his story was so important to tell?
Yeah, I think Alexander is emblematic of everything I've witnessed here in Ukraine the last 8 years, his life story. So he was a journalist living in Luhansk, Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, where he's from. And he grew up there, Russian speaker. And he was there when Russian forces invaded his hometown in 2014. And let's make no mistake, it was Russian forces who invaded. There's no, the idea that these were local separatists who rose up, that's all bullshit. They were organized, funded, armed, all that by Russia. So he was there, saw his homeland, his hometown taken over by Russia, and he had to leave. And he fled, left his hometown. He became a war journalist at first. Before the war, he was covering, cats and trees and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Called it normal journalism. And then after the war began, he became a war correspondent. And after about a year of that, he decided, I can't just report on my country's war. I need to be in it. I need to be a part of it. So he became a soldier. He had never fired a weapon before he went to basic training, and fired just 200 practice rounds during basic training. And then he was off to the front lines, eastern Ukraine. Did his tour in the front lines in the Donbass, returned, vowed to not go back to the front lines for another year, but resumed his work as a journalist, and then ended up becoming a war correspondent. He actually told me that he would have these like moments of like remembrance because his camera weighed the exact same amount as his Kalashnikov. And so he spoke very, just very movingly about the fact that it was very hard for him as a veteran to move on with his life because his war was still there. It was still going on. And that's something I think that many American veterans would likely understand as well, because, for many of us, we left our battlefields while our brothers and sisters were still on the front lines before our wars were over. And we had to somehow find a way to move on with our civilian lives, knowing that our war wasn't over yet. And so I think, that part of his story certainly resonated with me as a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. And he tried very hard. But always in the back of his mind, Alexander had this notion that maybe one day he'd have to go back to war. And simultaneously, he was never able to return to his homeland. He told me a story about a tree in Luhansk that he had carved his name into as a little boy. And it was his dream in life to return there one day and to see that engraved name again. Anyway, I knew him professionally, and I'd always just incredible admirer of his work and everything about him. But in the weeks leading up to the full-scale invasion, Alexander packed what he called a veteran's suitcase with all his gear ready to go within 24 hours should Russia invade. And he was among the first group of reservists who were set to be called up if there was a full-scale invasion. However, as a journalist, he was not obligated to serve. So he could have, declined and just kept on being a journalist, but he was committed to going back to war. And so, on February 24th, when the full-scale Russian invasion began, he grabbed his veteran suitcase, went to the nearest recruiting center, and signed back up. And that night, February 24th, he said goodbye to his girlfriend, Anastasia. And he went to the return to the war, proposed to Anastasia from the front lines in a video where he offered a pull pin from a grenade as the wedding ring.
Hold on, it was the pull pin from a grenade was their wedding ring.
Yeah, he said, I'll give you a proper wedding ring when I get back from war. And they were a beautiful couple. And anyway, he was killed in combat near Izium, was killed by artillery. And it's just somebody who knew him, very painful, but I think more than anything, just to see the pain in his fiance's face and her demeanor. I went to his funeral the other day, and it just laid bare the human toll of this war, but also just how this conflict with Russia, how Russia's invasions of this country have disrupted and destroyed so many lives. And this young man had so much going for him, and he tried so hard to leave this war behind, but he couldn't do it. And when his country needed him, he put it all on the line again, went back out there, and unfortunately had to give his life. But, I just thought his story was very emblematic. Like I said, I've known many other veterans of the Donbass conflict who have similarly had to rejoin active duty service and go out to the front lines. And some of them, like I mentioned earlier, had demons from what they'd previously seen. And so they had to return to their front. And I think that, as fellow veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. veterans, I think we can sort of imagine what it'd be like if suddenly we had to go back to those battlefields again. Yep. On a moment's notice. And even more compelling for the Ukrainians that their homeland has been invaded. They're defending their hometowns, their families, their streets, their apartments, their stuff, their friends. So anyway, he had a very powerful story. And I was very moved to be at his funeral. But as the war drags on, I do know more and more friends who are wounded or worse out in the front lines. And so
thank you for sharing that. I think your perspective and your ability to really share the details of Alexander as a human, right? As a person, as a fiance, as a friend, were so critical. And we'll link to your reporting in the show notes. There are photos there from the services. And I think this is, Nolan, the kind of reporting that you're in a very unique position to do, to tell his story, and to tell the stories that represent so much about what's happening. And just the human side of this, because it's easy to think of this as a video game or numbers on a TV screen, but there are so many human stories behind this that can only be told by someone who has that understanding and nuance that you do. Let me ask you maybe a final question here, Nolan. Mm-hmm. What's next? We want to talk about what's next, how these pieces connect. When you look across the summer in Ukraine, or you look across the next few weeks, what if someone's watching the news or reading the paper, they're trying to keep up on this, What would you encourage them to look for? We're going to obviously encourage everyone to follow your reporting, but what's the story to come, the story to watch for that you think will be really, really essential in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think, based on everything that I follow and the people I'm in touch with on the front lines, it seems as if Russia's second phase offensive, so-called second phase offensive, after they were defeated in the Battle of Kyiv, is running out of steam rapidly. And so Russia will not be able to, it looks like at this point, achieve a decisive uh, outcome which they can claim as victory before they are effectively a spent force in the South and the East. And where does that leave the war? You know, Unfortunately, I think when we look at sort of the rhetoric and the actions and the statements of Russian President Vladimir Putin, it doesn't look like he's willing to back down anytime soon. So I think probably the most likely outcome is this thing just grinds on for a while. I think you know Russia is about to be a spent force in the South and the East, and that offensive is going to slow down. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians have shown the ability to go on the attack too. Around Kyiv, they did it. They've pushed the Russians back from Kharkiv. And so as the Russians, like I said, sort of lose their steam, the Ukrainians are going to start to push back. The big question mark is, when faced with, an embarrassing defeat, what does Putin do next? Does he do something crazy to try and regain the advantage? Does he try and find some bullshit propaganda victory he can claim and back off? Is there something, we don't know what that will entail. So for now, it looks like the war is probably going to drag on for a while. But I think that, at the beginning of the conflict, there was a lot of talk about, is Ukraine going to take some peace deal or look for a ceasefire? Well, I think the appetite of many Ukrainians for any sort of negotiated end with Russia has rapidly eroded due to the atrocities.
Yep.
I've spent a lot of time in the outskirts of Kyiv after the Russians left, and it's some pretty brutal stuff out there. A lot of dead civilians, a lot of dead Russians, and so I think that the Ukrainians don't want to condemn their countrymen to Russian occupation. Right. And there's a huge appetite in Ukraine to start pushing back and to regain some of this lost ground. So that, at this point, barring some major anomaly or some unexpected event, it looks like we're set to see sort of just a grinding artillery back and forth in the South and East for a while.
And I think that those of us who've been in conflicts know that I don't think the public is ready for the brutality of what that could look like. The brutality of extended, protracted artillery battles, and just the imprecision and carnage that will result in is I think part of what people need to emotionally and intellectually ready themselves for, because you're going to want to turn away and you can't, because now it's that much more important, and your reporting is that much more important. You've been really powerfully telling these stories, Nolan. I'm grateful for it. I'm going to give a shout out again to the St. Javelin folks. I've got another shirt on this week. Every week I've got one. So I've got one with the Ukrainian farmers pulling a tank. I've been talking about them every week. Everybody check out St. Javelin for the shirts. But let me ask you one last question, Nolan. I promised that last one was going to be the last one. I got one more. What's your favorite thing about Ukraine, man? You live there. You're married to a family there. What's your favorite thing about Ukraine, or something you really love about Ukraine you feel like most Americans might not know or appreciate?
It might seem like a cop-out answer, but the people.
Yeah.
Man, it's like, I always, before the full-scale war, I was always trying to encourage people. And actually, I'll encourage people now, come visit Kyiv, come visit Ukraine. And I'd always say that, if you want to go see where history happened, go to Paris, London, wherever. If you want to see where history is happening, you got to come to Ukraine. And just the unbelievable energy of the young people in this country, the millennial generation, which gets, they get a bad rap in the United States sometimes. But this generation, which, in 2014, during the Revolution of Dignity, they walked into sniper fire for the sake of democracy and freedom. And they've been defending their country in the Donbass trenches for 8 years for the sake of freedom and democracy. And now, they've stared down a full-scale Russian invasion for all these things that we really cherish. And so, I come here and I kind of see, the American dream in action.
Yeah.
And it's pretty damn inspiring, and these are just baristas and university students and just normal people who grabbed guns and went down there and stared down Russian tanks in 2014, and they've fought for 8 years. And so their courage, their unbending faith in this dream, and the fact that they've never given up after all these years, it's really inspiring for me. And I it's probably what kept me here. And not even just the young people too, but my mother-in-law and my father-in-law grew up in the Soviet Union. My father-in-law is a Soviet Army veteran, and he's the most patriotic pro-American person you ever meet in the world right now. Just to see our best attributes.
That's it, man. I love it. That's going to be the American dream in action. It's not the American dream anymore. It's kind of a global dream, and it's maybe even more embodied. Like the American dream 2.0 is the Ukrainian dream, and you're telling that story and sharing that story. We're really, really thankful that you spent this time with us, and grateful for your heroic reporting, for representing both cultures in such an important way. And I'm glad we could spend so much time together, man. I really am grateful. I hope you'll come back. I'm going to stick around for our Patreon members. But thank you for being out there, man. Thank you for telling the story. Thank you for your heroism. Until next time, Slava Ukraini, and stay vigilant.
Royam Slava. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, man. Okay.